Greetings, and welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Southern, and as always, I'm glad to have you here today for another discussion of military history. Today, we're going to continue the story of the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber in the battles of the Second World War. This time, we won't be looking at the Dauntless specifically, but rather its land-based variant, the A-24 Banshee. This was a slightly modified version of the Dauntless that was employed by the United States Army Air Corps and the later Army Air Force. Though the Banshee was not a large part of the Army's air strength at the time, it was the only dedicated dive bomber type to be flown by the U.S. Army. In the early part of the war, the Banshee units fought valiantly in the uneven struggle against the oncoming Japanese in the Pacific. My sources for this one will be Douglas SBD Dauntless by Peter C. Smith, as well as SBD Dauntless units of the Second World War by Barrett Tillman. So now, with that said, let's return to the pre-war days of the United States, where rapid expansion of the armed forces was taking place in the light of the large and increasing threats of war in the Pacific as well as in Europe. In contrast to the Navy, the U.S. Army Air Corps had not pursued development of the dive bomber during the interwar period. Despite the very promising results of the Navy's experiment with this method of precision attack, the Army had no aircraft specialized for this task in service nor any apparent intention to acquire them. This was due to two aspects of the doctrine underlying the concept of air power as it was articulated by the Air Corps leadership. First and foremost was the commitment of the Army to the concept of high-altitude strategic bombing as a war-winning strategy. This meant that the bomber forces of the Army were not primarily intended to fly against battlefield targets, but rather against more distant industrial and communication targets in the rear areas and the enemy's home territories. Direct support of the ground forces by aircraft was left to the observation arm, which flew short-range reconnaissance and artillery spotting missions, and attack aviation, which specialized in the use of low-flying planes and strafing and bombing attacks on battlefield and logistics targets. The doctrine for the employment of Army attack aviation, where dive bombers and their close support function would be logically employed, was another major reason these aircraft were not acquired by the interwar Air Corps. The attack units were not intended or equipped for dive bombing missions. The methods focused instead on the use of guns, rockets, chemical weapons, and small bombs. The latter often equipped with drag parachutes to ensure the low-flying attack plane's safety from its own weapons. These were to be delivered by formations of aircraft in more or less level flight, at high speed and often at treetop height. The principal American attack plane, the sleek, twin-engine Douglas A-20 Havoc, was built for these type of low-altitude level bombing and gunfire attacks. This excellent aircraft was also a product of the designer of the Dauntless, Ed Heinemann. A three-man machine, powered by a pair of Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp two-row radials. It was fast and well-armed, with a powerful battery of machine guns in the nose as well as defensive turrets, and capable of carrying about 2 tons of bombs. It entered service with the French and British, who called it the Boston, before American entry into the war. Variants would serve as attack planes, medium bombers, night fighters, and long-range intruders. Almost 8,000 would be built before production was ended in 1944, and some would serve in auxiliary roles in the U.S. Air Force until 1949. However, this tactical doctrine was called into question by the experience of the war in Europe, in which the dive bombing attacks of the German Stukas had proven so devastatingly effective against the armies of Europe. These same campaigns had also cast doubt on the kind of bombing and ground attack tactics used by the Army Air Corps, which were similar to those used by the French Armée de l'Air and the British Royal Air Force. As a result, the Army began to look into acquiring dive bombers of its own. First, Army aviators looked into using the A-20 for dive bombing attacks. However, as we have seen earlier in this series, the extreme strain imposed on an aircraft structure during the pull-out phase of an attack dive was usually too strong for an aircraft the structure of which was not specifically designed to withstand it. This problem was magnified for a heavier twin-engine aircraft such as the Havoc. Also, the accuracy, which was the chief advantage of the diving attack, required a fairly steep diving angle. Specially designed air brakes or dive flaps were necessary to keep the plane from building up a dangerous amount of speed in a long dive. The A-20 had no such brakes. The test with the Havoc showed that the big plane was practically restricted to comparatively shallow diving attacks, with a maximum diving angle of perhaps 30 degrees. As a result of these tests, it was determined that extensive modifications, almost amounting to a total redesign, would be necessary if the A-20 was to be made effective in this role. A different solution, therefore, would have to be found. The Army could issue requirements to industry for a suitable aircraft. However, the design and development process for a new combat plane was not quick. It would take something like 18 months, most likely, before initial models of a new dive bomber could be put into production. However, There was an alternative to this. As we have seen, the Navy had been using dive bombers aboard their carriers for more than a decade at this point. On June 8, 1940, therefore, the Bureau of Aeronautics received a request from the Air Corps to provide an example of the latest Navy dive bomber design. This meant the SBD-2. This aircraft was to be evaluated for its potential for adaptation to Army use. In the words of General George H. Brett of the Army's Materiel Division, quote, "This will permit the Air Corps to take advantage of the years of research and development that have been conducted by the Navy on this type of airplane." The initial testing was performed on SBD-1s borrowed from the Marine Corps, which were given to the 24th Bombardment Squadron. As a result of these tests and of a staff conference that took place on the 19th, the Army committed itself to the procurement of these dive bombers. During the conference, the head of the Air Corps, Brigadier General H. Hap Arnold, pointed out that in order to field a modern combat force of the kind that had proven itself in Europe, the Air Corps would need to field at least 2 dive bomber groups, each of 3 or so squadrons, trained and equipped to cooperate with armored formations in offensive action. On the 26th of June, the first plan for the procurement of the aircraft to equip them was produced. This specified that the Army would acquire 78 SBD-2s, already due to be produced under a current Navy contract with Douglas, which would be modified to fit Army specifications. The Navy contract would be extended by this number to ensure that the fleet still received all the planes it needed. Navy and Army machines would be produced, with the 2 types alternating one after the other on the same production line at the manufacturing facility in El Segundo, California. The Army bombers were given the designation A-24, and the schedule called for them all to be delivered by August 1941. Modifications stipulated by the Army included the deletion of all gear for shipboard operations that would not necessitate a significant redesign. This included the arrestor gear, equipment for catapult launch, flotation gear, and the crash barrier hook installation. The actuator fairing for the arrestor hook, however, was retained so as not to require a redesign of the relevant section of the fuselage. Army specifications also called for leak-proof fuel storage, armor protection for the crewmen, and an armament of 2 fixed 30 caliber machine guns firing forward and 1 on a flexible mount in the rear cockpit. A new, somewhat larger pneumatic tailwheel would be used, and though the Model DU rotating loop-type radio direction finder was deleted, Navy radio gear was retained on these initial batch of A-24s, with the proviso that it was likely to be replaced by Army equipment at a later date. First of these new machines, with the serial number 41-15746, was delivered to Wright Field on the 18th of June 1941. 7 more arrived there by the 1st of August. These were deemed acceptable, and another batch of SBDs under production for the Navy, 90 SBD-3s this time, were assigned to the Army. The first 54 operational machines were assigned to the 27th Bombardment Group, now redesignated the 27th Bombardment Group Dive, based at Savannah, Georgia. This group was made up of the 16th, 17th, and 91st Squadrons. Another bombardment group, the 3rd, also began training on the new plane, which began to reach them also in the summer of 1941. The men of the 27th Bombardment Group boarded ship from San Francisco on the 1st of November, bound for the new stations in the Philippines. Unfortunately, the 52 Banshees intended for their use were carried on a following ship, which, due to the outbreak of the war, was diverted en route to Brisbane, Australia. Most of the valuable experience of these aviators, unfortunately, was thus lost in the first weeks of the war. The Japanese assault on the islands found them without planes to fly, and nearly the entire unit was lost fighting on the ground instead as infantry against the invading Japanese army. A small party of pilots did manage to escape the debacle, leaving the area on the 18th of December, reaching Darwin on the northern coast of Australia 4 days later. Hoping to get their planes in time to return and contest the enemy advance in the Philippines, the Army flyers were disgusted to find that their aircraft had been sent out without critical components, which prevented them from being assembled and put into flying shape. Major John H. Davies, the new commander of the remnants of the group, recorded his feelings about the snafu thus, quote, "When our dive bombers did arrive in Australia, they were lacking parts that prevented their assembly for combat activity till the opportunity to get them against the advancing enemy in the Philippines had gone. The persons in America responsible for sending our dive bombers over without gun mounts, trigger motors, sights, etc., in my opinion should be subject to trial for criminal negligence. Understandable as the Major's frustration was, it's nonetheless unlikely that the intervention even of a fully equipped dive bomber group would have made much impact on the Japanese blitzkrieg through the archipelago." Despite the difficulties involved in the process, the A-24s which arrived in Australia were concentrated at Amberley and Archerfield airfields. Here they were put into flying shape. first one taking off on the 29th of December. Weapons and other critical combat gear were still lacking, however. As enough were made airworthy, the remaining pilots who had made it out of the Philippines were organized into a training unit. As U.S. airmen freshly graduated from flight training arrived in Australia, some were sent here and to be trained by these men in the technique of dive bombing. Once enough were trained, they would be organized into fighting units and sent back to the Philippines, or such was the plan. To oversee this operation, Captain Ed Backus was sent to Archer Field to command this unit, the 91st Bomb Squadron. While the basis of A-24 combat operations was thus being set up in Australia, debate over the needs of Army aviation in the emerging war situation were taking place in Washington, D.C. A Senate committee chaired by Harry S. Truman recommended abandoning the Army dive bomber project altogether and equipping the planned 16 groups of such planes with fighters. This recommendation was not accepted by General Marshall. Though the Army would continue to build up a dive bomber force, the use of the Banshee was seen as a temporary stopgap measure until aircraft with better performance could be procured. The intention was to use an Army version of the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, called the A-25, which was still under development, or the Vultee Vengeance, known as the A-31 in the Army system, which was then being produced for the British. However, these two projects were experiencing delays, and the prospects of quantity production for the Army were not good in the short term. So, on March 7, 1942, 170 more SBD-3s, already being produced for a Navy contract, were diverted to the Army. This contract was extended as a result and plans made for SBD/A-24 production to be expanded. As it happened, the 170 A-24s developed as a result of this request were conversions of an upgraded version, known to the Navy as the SBD-4. This differed from the SBD-3 mainly in the substitution of a 24-volt electrical system from the previous 12-volt equipment. This allowed the aircraft to be fitted with electronic gear such as radio navigation aids and radar sets. The new model also used a new model Hamilton Standard constant-speed propeller. The lack of a conical spinner for this new propeller is the chief external difference distinguishing this and later models. The new model also incorporated an electric fuel pump. The Dash 4 was slightly faster, topping out at 245 miles per hour, or 395 kph, and heavier than the Dash 3, and had a marginally reduced service ceiling and range with full bomb load. The low speed of these aircraft, especially their low cruising speed, earned the SBD the nickname slow but deadly among Navy flyers. This relative sluggishness would be the main drawback of the Banshee and the chief complaint against it on the part of Army flyers. The 170 planes purchased on this Navy contract were just the beginning. In late April, the Air Corps informed the Douglas Company of its intention to order a further 1,700 A-24s. Originally, these were to be fitted with the Wright R-1820-40 engine, but a subsequent directive changed this to the R-1820-52. The first 10 A-24s on this order were to be delivered in February 1943. Afterwards, series production would commence, with the subsequent aircraft using the R-1829-G200, same engine used on its Navy counterparts. Schedule of monthly production was laid out, beginning with 6 in the month of February 1943 through 70 in July, and reaching full production speed in October, when monthly output would reach 130 machines. In order to make this rate of production possible, the manufacturing capacity of the Douglas Company needed to be greatly expanded. The plant at El Segundo, where the only SBD production line was running, had been enormously upgraded. From the monthly output of 20 SBDs at the time of Pearl Harbor attack, it attained a daily rate of 11 planes. This, however, was not enough to fulfill the Army contracts as well as sustaining the required rate of deliveries to the Navy. In order to meet this demand and get aircraft to the fighting front as quickly as possible, a second major facility was built in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was at this new plant that the majority of the A-24s, as distinct from the SBDs, were produced. The demands of wartime use in the Pacific and the need to ensure that the Navy received sufficient SBDs for its crucial carrier air groups necessitated some adjustment of the proposed production schedule. On July 1st, a final agreement was reached on the production of the Army planes at Tulsa. 1,200 were to be produced there under the original contract. The Army and Navy versions were to use as many common parts as possible in order to facilitate rapid production. In the event, they were practically identical except for radio and some other minor items of equipment. First 55 production machines would be designated A-24s, or sometimes A-24As. These would be fitted with the Dash 52 engine and the original 12-volt electrical system. These were thus identical to the Navy's SBD-3. The remainder would be designated the A-24B, using the Dash 40 engine and the 24-volt electrical system, making them virtually the same as the Navy's new model, the SBD-5. However, difficulties arose with the standardization process, as the different operational requirements and procurement policies of the two services resulted in the need to incorporate a number of minor design changes to the original SBD-5 to accommodate the Army-specific equipment. Aside from the radio gear mentioned above, the Army used a different autopilot, hydraulic gear, instrumentation, and oxygen system than the Navy, as well as different machine guns and mounts. Some equipment needed for operations from land bases but not for shipboard use, such as dust filters, were required by the Army planes while the carrier gear was not. In addition, a new version of the R-1820 engine, the -60, was coming into production, and the aircraft were modified to take it. The detailed redesign process to adapt the SBD to Army use delayed the actual beginning of upgraded Banshee production for more than a month. First A-24 came off the line at the new Tulsa plant on March 16, 1943. 686 A-24s would be produced for the Army, with 615 of these actually joining the service. The difference is accounted for by the initial batch of 60 planes built at El Segundo. On delivery, it was found that these California-built planes would need to be fitted with Army gear before being issued to units, so, perhaps ironically, the aircraft were instead turned back over to the Navy. Redesignated SBD-5As, these planes were then, on April 29th, handed over to the Marines. Meanwhile, production for the Navy continued at an accelerated pace, and Navy SBDs would heavily outnumber their Army counterparts. Between October 1942 and February 1943, the Navy took delivery of 780 SBD-4s. More came afterwards. The first SBD-5, with the new -60 engine, coming off the line on February 21st. From that date until April 1944, 2,963 more would follow, making this by far the most numerous model of the Dauntless. To this already impressive total, most of the A-24s can be added, making more than 3,600 of the -5 type dive bombers produced altogether. Aside from the new engine, the -5 differed from the -4 in several details. These details also distinguish the A-24A from the A-24B. The 3-power telescopic bomb sight, which is prone to fogging up in a dive, was replaced by the much more advanced Mark 7 reflector type. Similar fogging problems on the canopy windscreen were addressed by the addition of a defogger and heater unit. Minor changes to the carburetor air scoop and the cowl flaps were also introduced on this model. Except for the deletion of the bomb sight, however, there is little difference in external appearance from the -4. The -5 was also given mountings to carry a pair of 58-gallon or 264-liter drop tanks, which could extend its range to 1,340 nautical miles in scouting configuration. Range without the external tanks remained identical to the previous model at 1,115 nautical miles. The service ceiling was also again slightly lowered to 24,300 feet, or 7,400 meters. The new model had marginally enhanced maximum speed to 252 miles per hour, 405 kph, but a still lower cruising speed, dropping from 150 miles per hour, or 240 kph, to only 130, or 210 kph. This lack of speed, as we have noted, would make the dive bomber very vulnerable to enemy fighters. This would be the final production version of the Dauntless/Banshee aircraft. Turning back to the theater of fighting, we've already seen how the first A-24 group, deployed to the Philippines before the Japanese strike there, was lost in the invasion of these islands. Men fought as infantry against the Japanese on the ground and were nearly all lost. They were compelled to do this as their aircraft, following the men across the Pacific on a different ship, had been diverted en route to Australia after the outbreak of hostilities. Here, we remember, they had set up a forward training school to teach dive bombing to new airmen coming from the west coast, with the intention of heading back north and rejoining the fight in the Philippines once enough dive bomber crews had been trained to use the Banshee in combat. Essential components, however, had not been sent along with the unassembled aircraft. Nonetheless, a handful of Banshees were kept in the air by improvisations such as homemade bomb sights and the modification of truck tires to fit their landing gear. These aircraft were used to train some of the green pilots into passable dive bomber crewmen. This unit was the 91st Bombardment Squadron, part of the 27th Bomb Group. Total combat strength in the 91st amounted to 3 Banshees when it arrived at Darwin, on the north coast of Australia opposite New Guinea, in the evening of the 8th of February. From there, they were scheduled to move further north into the Dutch East Indies, which were then coming under attack. They would begin the move on the next day, when they were slated to fly to Koh-Pang airfield on the island of Timor. They would proceed in company with a group of 8 Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters, which would be led by an LB-30 of the Dutch Colonial Air Force. This was an export version of the American B-10 twin-engine bomber. This flight from Darwin to Koh-Pang would cover a distance of 530 miles, or 850 kilometers. During the flight, the 3 dive bombers, led by Captain Edward N. Backus, became separated from the Dutch guide plane and the fighters, and had to make the passage over the Timor Sea alone and in bad weather. This turned out to be good luck, though, as the Dutch plane became lost and was compelled to turn back to Darwin. All 8 of the P-40s following it were lost as they ran out of fuel and went down at sea. Fortunately, Banshee's luck did not hold, and flak from the Australian defenders of Koh Pang airfield engaged the Banshees as they attempted to land. All 3 were shot up, but managed to land safely. 2 of the 3 were so badly damaged, however, that they had to be immediately sent back to Darwin for repair. Bacchus patched up the one remaining flyable Banshee and, the next morning, moved on alone to Pasaran in eastern Java. Out of the 12 planes that set out on this trip from Darwin to Java, then, his was the only one to complete the journey. In the absence of any enemy intervention, no fewer than 10 of these planes were lost by the Allies. Another group of 11 A-24s led by Lieutenant Harry L. Galusha had better luck, leaving Darwin on the 11th and all successfully making the first stage of their flight to Koh Pang, despite the entire journey being flown over cloud cover that reached almost all the way down to the sea. Here the group refueled, and the next morning took off in 3 sections. The first, a pair, set off at dawn for Denpasar and Bali, passing over a pair of Japanese destroyers on the way. The second section, of 5 planes, took off a few minutes after the first and made for Mangiapur on the island of Soemba. 4 remaining planes followed the initial pair to Bali, and also sighted the Japanese destroyers, but as the aircraft were all unarmed, they were unable to make attacks on them. One of the planes that landed on Soembo was damaged in a landing accident and needed repair. It would be patched up later and follow behind the main group. The remaining 10 moved on to Pasaran in eastern Java, joined up with Captain Bacchus and his single Banshee that had survived the initial transfer flight. On the 16th, all these planes then proceeded to Batavia, with the exception of one which had developed engine trouble and another which had been lost when its landing gear locked in the up position, forcing the pilot to ditch his A-24 in the sea off Surabaya. Both of these pilots would later join the rest at Batavia. Finally, on the 18th of February, the remaining 7 A-24s still in flying shape took up their station at Malang Airfield. This is a primitive facility with no control tower, little equipment, and no bomb shackles or adapters to fit them to the aircraft. However, continuing the method imposed on them since their arrival in Australia, the men of the 91st at Malang managed to improvise what they needed. One of the other squadrons of the 27th Bomb Group, the 16th, set off to join them, heading for Darwin with 15 A-24s 12 days after the departure of the 91st. 5 of these developed engine trouble and had to be repaired, but joined the rest of the squadron at Bachelor Airfield the next day. From here they were to depart for Koh Pang, but word reached that the airfield there was threatened with investment by the Japanese, and their departure was delayed. The next day the field there, along with most of the rest of Timor, was indeed overrun. Even worse would come when a powerful Japanese carrier force under Vice Admiral Nagumo, consisting of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, made itself felt here. This was the same force that would fight the Battle of Midway 4 months later. Their naval aviators mounted a pair of devastating raids on Darwin and the shipping in the harbor, and as a result of these 2 setbacks, the 16th was never sent on to Java. They remained at Darwin for the next few weeks, flying patrols over the ocean looking for a suspected Japanese invasion force. On the 22nd, they were joined by a 3rd squadron of the 27th Group, the 17th under Major Davies, freshly trained and equipped with another 15 dive bombers. Meanwhile, their compatriots which had preceded them further north mounted the first dive bombing attack to be carried out by the U.S. Army. A Japanese invasion fleet had been spotted in the Sanyor Roads, and the ships were putting troops ashore there to conquer the island of Bali. They were part of an invasion column carrying the Japanese 48th Infantry, and were accompanied by a naval escort consisting of a cruiser and 4 destroyers. 7 A-24s were at Madang Airfield, and these were ready to strike the ships in the landing beaches. These were all armed with 660-pound or 300-kilogram bombs on the fuselage centerline, and a pair of 110-pound or 50-kilogram bombs under the wings. As a precaution against a surprise Japanese raid while the planes were being prepared, the 2 aircraft that were already armed and fueled were sent into the air to circle the field and await the others. Crews of these 2 planes, however, decided instead to begin scouting for the enemy ships right away. For most of the way they were shielded from observation from the surface by a pair of flat cloud decks below, but when they reached Denpasar, the cover parted and revealed a pair of Japanese ships below, reported as a cruiser and a transport vessel. Using the remaining cloud for cover, the pair of planes maneuvered into attack position and dove from just above the upper cloud deck, from an altitude of about 11,000 feet or 3,300 meters. Both ships were attacked, with the Banshees releasing their payloads at 3,000 feet or 900 meters. The Japanese were caught unawares, and almost no anti-aircraft fire rose to meet the planes as they plunged down. Pilots claimed direct hits on both with their small wing bombs and close near misses with their main weapons. A Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, which had been observing the Japanese vessels, witnessed the attack and reported that it was a success, with both ships left in a sinking condition, likely due to underwater damage caused by the near misses. In reality, the attack was not so successful. The ship reported as a Japanese cruiser was actually a destroyer, either the Asashio or the Michishio, and it was not damaged in the attack. The transport was the 7,200-ton Sagami Maru. She had in fact suffered a direct hit from one of the main bombs, which blew up in her engine room. However, she was not sunk, and was later able to restore her own power and withdraw from the area, escorted by the pair of destroyers. The rest of the Banshees are not recorded as having attacked that day. However, they would be in action on the next, and all 7 were sent to hit the Japanese on Bali in company with 3 Dutch LB-30s and a fighter escort of 16 P-40s. En route to the target, over the Badong Strait between Nusa Besar and Bali, a group of enemy ships was spotted. This consisted of 2 troop ships covered by 3 destroyers and the cruiser Nagara. The dive bombers decided to go after these vessels instead. The first section of 3 attacked the Nagara, making their dives from 12,000 feet, or 3,600 meters, while the other 4 attacked the transports. The cruiser threw up a deadly barrage. The first Banshee, crewed by 2nd Lieutenant Douglas B. Tubb and Private D.S. McKay, was hit repeatedly and dove into the sea. The next one down, the 2nd Lieutenant Richard H. Launder and Corporal I.W. Lanika, released on the cruiser from minimum altitude, claiming a direct hit. They pulled out of the dive just above the surface of the water, and as they made their way out from among the Japanese ships were hit by flak and badly damaged, taking a hit in the engine which severed the main oil line, covering the nose and canopy with oil. In this state, and with half of their elevator shot away, they passed over Tafel Hook Peninsula and looked for a place to put their stricken plane down. They found an airfield, but at the last moment realized it was occupied by the enemy, and after a narrow escape put their plane down offshore. Though injured in the water landing, the 2 men made it ashore and evaded the Japanese troops for 3 days, eventually making their way back to the squadron at Madang. Captain Bacchus was the last to attack the cruiser, and also claimed hits with all of his bombs, and to have left the Nagara on fire and dead in the water. Altogether, the Banshees claimed hits on the cruiser, a destroyer, and both transports. Later reconnaissance flight recorded that 2 ships had been sunk and that the cruiser was towing away a damaged destroyer. These reports were also inaccurate, and in fact no Japanese ships were lost as a result of this attack. This would be their last strike in this kind of strength. Over the next 3 days, the Japanese would mount numerous strafing and bombing attacks on their base. The Army Airmen's experience of frequent bombardment in this forward position had something of the flavor of that of their Navy and Marine counterparts at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal 6 months later. Also like the bombers of the Cactus Air Force, they attempted night attacks against their enemies. On the night of February 23rd, under bright moonlight, the pair took off at 18:15 hours to look for shipping in the direction of Bali, with Denpasar Airfield as their alternate target. No ships were sighted, so the pair proceeded to the airfield and attacked, but were unable to observe the effects of their runs. By the 26th, Banshee's strength at Madang was reduced to 4 aircraft. However, their lack of numbers and the growing air supremacy of the Japanese did not deter them from going after enemy ships supporting the effort to take the Dutch islands. Another invasion convoy had been spotted to the northeast of Bawain Island, apparently headed for Java. Galusha, who had now succeeded Bacchus in command of the 91st, received orders to strike the troop transports and readied his surviving planes. One of these had to abort almost immediately after the failure of its hydraulic system, reducing the force to 3. These 3 Banshees went after the ships, escorted by Allied fighters. They found a large amount of Japanese shipping, and overflew the enemy fleet without attacking, picking out the most profitable targets for their few bombs. Dive bombers claimed hits on 2 and possibly 3 transports. The 3 bombers fled the scene afterwards, covered by the fighters, who subsequently reported watching a 14,000-ton transport sink as a result of the attack, as well as fires aboard nearby Japanese destroyers. However, these reports proved to be as inaccurate as some of the previous ones, and no enemy ships were badly damaged. This attack would be the last mounted by the 91st during the battle for Java and the surrounding islands. Though the airmen had proven themselves persistent in their efforts against the Japanese invasion fleets, the results were negligible, with the hit on the Sagami Maru being the only damage of consequence inflicted by the Banshees. The remaining aircraft, heavily outnumbered and outperformed by the Japanese aircraft swarming the islands, were evacuated south shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, the 2 A-24 squadrons that we left at Darwin in the aftermath of Nagumo's carrier raids in February were being joined by new dive bomber units arriving from the United States. These were elements of the 3rd Bomb Group. The first new squadron to head for Australia was the 8th Light Bombardment Squadron, which left San Francisco on the 31st of January aboard the Army transport ship Ancon. They arrived at Brisbane on the 25th of February, soon moved on to Charters Tower Airfield in Queensland, where they would conduct operational training on the Banshee. In mid-March, new planes arrived to replace the older ones used by the 16th Squadron at Darwin. This squadron and the 17th were then moved to Townsville, and from there joined the A Squadron at Charters Towers. Some of the men of these two 27th Group squadrons were incorporated into the 3rd Bomb Group, which, in addition to the A-24s of the A Squadron, included units flying B-25 medium bombers and A-20 attack planes. By the end of March, they were ready for action. Japanese advance had meanwhile continued. The battlefield was now New Guinea, the last natural barrier between the new Japanese conquests and Australia itself. On the 31st, the A Squadron, with 13 Banshees, was ordered north to oppose them. Like had happened in the initial dispatch of Banshees to Java, this unit suffered heavy attrition before reaching the battle zone. 5 of the aircraft developed faults on the way and were left at Cooktown. The remaining 8 pushed on to 7 Mile Airfield at Port Moresby, but a miscommunication of the time of sunset there caused them to arrive after dark. 2 more were wrecked when they hit unseen bomb craters on the runway. The new arrivals would be in action on the first opportunity, at 600 hours on the next day, April 1st. The squadron leader reported sick on arrival, so the strike would be led by Lieutenant Bob Ruegg. Their target was the Japanese airfield at Lae, some 175 miles or 280 kilometers north of Port Moresby. 5 A-24s were armed with 500-pound or 227-kilogram demolition bombs and sent out. They found low cloud over Lae, which prevented the attack, and struck instead the secondary target, the field at Salamoa. This they could see well enough, but the field at this time was used only for staging and refueling of aircraft, and none were present on the ground. On the other hand, there was no opposition to the Banshees' attacks, which blasted craters in the runway and set the buildings there on fire. After this first raid, the unit was visited by General Kelly, Allied commander in the area. Though the dive bombers were scheduled to return to the mainland after perhaps one more raid, the general wanted them to remain and continue flying against the invasion force. The squadron, which had not come to stay, had just 4 aircraft in flyable shape and only 7 bombs with which to arm them. The general listened to their requirements to continue operations there. These included a fairly comprehensive list of maintenance equipment, as well as spares and consumable supplies, about 24 maintenance personnel, and above all, more aircraft. Some new planes came later in the week on the 6th, when 6 A-24s arrived at Port Moresby from Charters Towers. With the dive bomber strength bolstered by these new arrivals, another raid on Lae was planned for that day. The A-24s took off, circled the airfield waiting for their fighter cover, with which they were to rendezvous at 1100 hours. The Allied fighters failed to show up. Instead, a Japanese raiding force showed up and pounded the airfield. Banshees avoided the Japanese aircraft by heading out to sea, where they remained until the raiders had left. They returned, landed, and then moved later in the day to the nearby field at Kila Kila. From here, 9 Banshees, led again by Lieutenant Ruegg, took off at dawn the next day. Planes carried 500-pound demolition bombs and small incendiaries under each wing. 1 developed engine trouble after takeoff and had to abort, and the remaining 8 pushed on to Lae, which they found unalerted and covered with enemy aircraft lined up in the open. They approached the field at 13,000 feet, 3,900 meters, and made their attacks unopposed. Ruegg, first in, sighted a group of 5 Navy Type 0 carrier fighters drawn up in a circle, refueling from a tanker vehicle in the center, and made this his target. He dropped his payload dead center, wrecking all 5 fighters as well as the refueling vehicle. The other 7 A-24s followed suit, blasting the parked aircraft, are credited with the destruction of 20 of them. On the way out, a Zero fighter was claimed shot down by the defensive fire of a section of A-24s. One of the Army planes, piloted by Lieutenant Hank Schwartz, became separated from the formation and did not return. Another strike on Lae was mounted by the A Squadron on the 11th, with 9 A-24s, covered by Kitty Hawk fighters of the Royal Australian Air Force. They were covered by cloud part of the way, but, unlike the last time, Japanese fighters saw them coming. The first section of 3, led again by Lieutenant Ruegg, were all chased down through their attack dives by Japanese fighters. 2 of them overshot, but the third remained glued to Ruegg's tail as he dove on a small ship in the harbor. The lieutenant was forced to jettison his bombs and abort his attack to take evasive action to avoid the fire of the Zero. The Japanese pilot kept with him until he himself was shot down by one of the Australian fighters. The other 8 Banshees hit aircraft in flak positions on the field and made good their escape, with the exception of 1, flown by 2nd Lieutenant Gus Kitchen, who was shot down by one of the defending fighters. The fires started on the field by this attack were observed to still be burning 2 days later, when the A Squadron returned. A large oil tanker had been reported in the harbor there, and this priority target was the object of the mission. However, as we've seen so far, the reports of reconnaissance aircraft seem to have been particularly unreliable at this stage in the war, and when the Banshees arrived, there was no such ship to be found. Dive bombers selected alternative targets on the nearby airfield then, with Lieutenant Ruegg smashing a camouflaged anti-aircraft artillery position which revealed itself by opening up on the formation, and the other bombers hit bomber aircraft parked on the field. On the same day, more A-24s would arrive from Australia, but dive bombing attacks were suspended for a short period due to the lack of Allied fighters to escort them through the increasingly contested skies over New Guinea. In the interval, on the 17th, the ground crew and support personnel that the 8th had asked General Kelly for arrived, with 70 men under Captain C.A. Boomhauer arriving in Port Moresby. On the 22nd, the Banshees returned to the air, but with less than spectacular results. 4 bombers took off to hit the Japanese, but found that bad weather obscured all possible targets. This was bad enough, but mechanical failure compelled one of the 4 to belly land on returning to the field, wrecking his aircraft. The next day, the Banshees were up again, looking for a reported Japanese submarine, which was not found. Meantime, Japanese air raids on Port Moresby were intensifying, and the Allied fighters on hand, reduced to perhaps 4 or 5 serviceable machines, were unable to make much of a dent in them. One such strike by Mitsubishi G4M twin-engine bombers, known to the Allies as Betties, was particularly damaging in material terms. Bombing blind and through a heavy cloud layer, the Japanese bombers struck the A-24 dispersal area, totally destroying 3 fully armed and fueled Banshees and inflicting damage on several others, though no personnel were injured. Another strike mission was planned for the beginning of May, as a unit of P-39 Airacobra fighters had arrived to provide protection for the dive bombers. However, these fighters took such heavy losses between their arrival on the 29th of April and the 1st of May that this had to be called off. Instead, some of the 8th Squadron's personnel flew to the rear, where they picked up some new A-24s to bring forward. On the next night, 3 of the A-24s were scrambled at night to chase down a Japanese scout plane that was seen lurking in the area, but this proved to be a friendly Catalina flying boat. The next day, reconnaissance spotted a Japanese invasion fleet headed south, making for Port Moresby, and this was the sighting that set in motion the Battle of the Coral Sea. The 8th Squadron set about getting all available Banshees, 19 in total, ready to repel this next and largest Japanese effort. The convoy was still far out of range, forming up near Mishima Island when it was spotted. The squadron was held on short notice alert to act against this force beginning on the 5th. However, bad weather and lack of fighter protection kept them on the ground until the 7th, when they were ordered into the air and out to sea to avoid an incoming air raid on their base. By the time the Banshees were able to take off again and set off after the convoy, it was found to be already heading back towards the north out of range. The 8th was thus denied a chance to play a part in this major battle, and received reports of the progress of the action at sea while grounded under low clouds and persistent mist. The alert was finally called off on the 9th. Ironically, it would be shortly after this stand-down order was given that they would next find themselves under fire, as a Japanese raid hit their field that morning, destroying 4 A-24s on the ground and killing one of their pilots, Lieutenant Heindinger, as he sat in his aircraft's cockpit attempting to start the engine. Banshees would remain in New Guinea until the 14th. However, no further missions would be flown in this period. Requests for attacks by Allied HQ were presented to the squadron commanders once or twice. The Japanese control of the air had reached the point where these were refused unless fighter cover could be given. This was not available, and given their powerlessness to act in the hostile skies and mounting losses from Japanese raids, A Squadron and its 5 remaining serviceable A-24s were withdrawn back to Australia, and joined the rest of the dive bombers at Charters Towers Airfield, where they would remain for the next 2 months. The occasion of their return would be a new Japanese thrust at New Guinea. This was called Operation Ree. It's called for a landing of 2,000 troops near Oro Bay, places known as Buna and Gona. These were on the southwest arm of the island, directly across the Owen Stanley Mountains, about 65 miles or 105 kilometers from Port Moresby. The invasion convoy, escorted by 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and a mine layer, set out from Rabaul on the 20th of July. The next day, they reached the target beach and put the men ashore. The A Squadron was immediately recalled from Charters Towers, and on the 21st they arrived back at Port Moresby with 8 A-24s. They planned to strike on the landing force the next day. This was carried out by 7 of the bombers outfitted with 500-pound bombs. Planes went after the shipping. Some hits were achieved, but the pilots were unable to observe the results more closely as they sped away from the landing beaches after making their dives. The Banshees were then sent to attack targets ashore. On the next day, the target was a former missionary compound at Gona, which had been taken over by the Japanese and used as a headquarters. All of their bombs fell among the buildings being used by the invaders, which were seen to be fiercely burning as the American planes withdrew. On the 27th, 5 dive bombers struck targets along the Buna Road near the village of Serenanoe. A long stretch of the road was blasted with 500-pound demolition bombs. One of the Banshees scored a direct hit on a shack at the side of the road, which was being used by the Japanese to store ordnance, and this went up with a huge explosion that left the area devastated and started large fires. The next target would take them back out to sea. On the 26th, the Japanese reinforcement convoy of 8 ships with a destroyer escort left Rabaul, headed for Buna. These were found by Allied reconnaissance while about 50 miles or 80 kilometers north of their destination. 7 airworthy A-24s on hand were armed and fueled and set out, in the words of their commander Major Rogers, to, quote, contest their right to be there. The dive bombers were covered by a force of P-40 fighters. As the Banshees approached the Japanese ships and maneuvered into attack position, they became separated from their fighter escort, and as they went into their dives, they were set upon by a large force of defending fighters. 5 of the 7 A-24s were shot down in the ensuing air battle. One of the surviving planes, crewed by Lieutenant Hill and his gunner Sergeant Sam, made their way out of the vicinity of the Japanese ships after pulling out of their attack dive, pursued by several Zeros. During the desperate chase, the plane was repeatedly hit. The gunner was shot in the right hand early on, but nonetheless kept firing his .30 caliber machine gun until he exhausted his ammunition. Still, the Zeros pursued, and the sergeant resorted to pulling his .45 caliber sidearm and blasting at the attacking aircraft with it, while being hit twice more. Lieutenant Hill managed to outfly their antagonists and brought his shredded Banshee back to the Allied field at Milne Bay. Unfortunately, Sergeant Sam died a few days later of the wounds he had sustained in the combat. Only one Banshee, flown by Lieutenant Wilkins, made it back to base from this attack. 2 more damaged planes crash-landed in Allied-held territory, and the 4 crewmen were found by patrols of the Australian Army. However, they were all soon captured along with their rescuers by the advancing Japanese. This massacre was not entirely in vain. The Banshees had scored 2 direct hits in the attack, one on the troop ship Ayase de San Maru and another on the destroyer Azuki, both of which turned back towards Rabaul under their own power. The remaining A-24s at Port Moresby, however, were taken out of service. The dive bombers were withdrawn from New Guinea after this debacle. It seemed that the persistent complaints of the Banshee pilots of the aircraft's sluggishness and vulnerability to fighter attack were justified. They returned to Charters Towers in Australia and handed over their Banshees. The type would no longer be employed in the New Guinea campaign, and training on the field there would be reoriented towards the use of the A-20. And I think that is where I'm going to end this episode. Hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. Though they were through on New Guinea, the Banshee was not done blasting the Japanese in the Pacific alongside its Navy and Marine counterparts. They would go on to fly throughout the campaigns in the Central Pacific as well as in the reconquest of the Philippines. Next time we'll look at another part of the struggle going on in the Southwest Pacific at this time, one relevant to the battles in New Guinea and in the Solomons. This will be a purely naval action, or rather a pair of them, 2 big carrier battles that were fought in the course of this bloody campaign. These clashes, those of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz, were no less harrowing than those fought in the Coral Sea and at Midway. Together they form a third aspect of Dauntless's career in the Southwest Pacific, one interwoven with the fortunes of their land-based compatriots flying the Banshee in New Guinea, or the Dauntless from Henderson Field. So I hope you'll join me for that. Till then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.